Welcome to the Ancient Warfare Magazine podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. In this episode, we'll be looking at Volume 8, Issue 2, War, Trade and Adventure, Struggles of the Ionian Greeks. Don't forget, if you've not read the magazine, you can find back issues at ancient-warfare.com. Joining me to discuss the topic is Josho Brouwers, Murray Dahm, Lindsay Powell, Mark McCaffery and Cezary Kucewicz. For those who've not read the magazine, shall we start with who were the Ionian Greeks?
Yeah, it's the maybe I should talk a little bit about how this issue came about, because the people vote on most of the themes for Ancient Warfare, and one of the options that people emailed to me was about the Ionian Greeks, and it seemed like a really good idea to me. So I put that in the options to vote on, and it got picked. Don't exactly remember what it was running up against, a bunch of other archaic Greek stuff undoubtedly. So I put it in there. Most of the proposals that I received was quite obviously about the Ionian revolts, which are probably the most famous. When you think about the Ionians, you probably immediately think about the Ionian revolts as the prelude to the Persian Wars proper. And I didn't really want to do that. I wanted to sort of try to avoid that as much as possible, because usually with Ancient Warfare we try to do something that isn't quite as obvious and on the nose as you might think. So also with this particular issue, I didn't want article after article about different stuff taking place during the Ionian revolts. We'd also sort of done that with the marathon special, where we had a bit about the Ionian revolt. So I really wanted to sort of change that up. And the only thing that made it into the issue that deals with the Ionian revolts is Sidney Dean's article on the Battle of Lade, which is interesting, of course, as a defeat. To turn things around a little bit. So what I tried to do with the Ionian Greeks was show that there's more to the Ionian Greeks than just the Ionian revolts, because the Greeks themselves, even though they all shared this idea of being Greek, were very differentiated. There was a lot of differences between Greeks from one part of the Greek world and Greeks from other parts of the Greek world, and most of them could be grouped together according to their particular dialect. So Ionian Greeks were people who spoke Ionic Greek, which is a dialect different from Dorian and Aeolic, which are the other two main dialects. There's some scholarly debate going on about what we should call these dialects specifically, and what the relationships are, and how Macedonian fits into that and stuff like that. But basically, the three big dialect groups are Ionian, Aeolic, and Doric, Dorian, and Dorian Greek. And if you look at something like Smyrna, which is probably the birthplace of Homer, you have the Homeric epics written in an artificial mixture of Ionic and some Aeolic elements. And in this particular issue, I really wanted to focus on those Ionian Greeks, which you can include the Athenians. With those, the Athenians spoke Attic Greek, which is a variation on Ionic Greek, and the Athenians considered themselves the autochthonous from the ground themselves, as being the real genuine Greeks, the precursors of later Ionians. They thought that the Ionians had gone overseas, settled in Asia Minor and some of the islands off the coast, and other bits of the Aegean, and of course gave the name also to the region of Ionia in Asia Minor. And they, especially in classical times, were opposed to the Dorians in particular. The Dorians, of course, mostly Sparta, for example, was a considered characteristic Dorian, even though it is, of course, quite unique for the most part. It has some features that it shares with, for example, societies that we know lived on Crete, etc., etc. But there was a big opposition, Dorians versus Ionians. And one of the things that we tried to do with this issue is show just how varied the Dorians were, and that you can write sort of like Ionians were, and that you can write sort of an Ionian history if you want to. Show how the Ionians were unique, how the Ionians in the course of the 8th and 7th centuries BC gave their name to Greeks as a whole, because they came in frequent contact with other civilizations in the ancient Near East, the Assyrians and Egyptians. So Ionian came to be to designate Greeks in the Near East. And they were explorers, they were traders, they were mercenaries, they colonized loads of other places of the Mediterranean, and they were also, especially in the Archaic period, very much at the forefront of artistic and cultural developments, poetry, etc., etc. Homer, once again, is a good example, I think. And we wanted to also show in this issue not just the earlier history, the Archaic history, but also to sort of extend it into the classical period, and even until Alexander the Great. And of course, by the time of Alexander the Great, you can see that most of the dialects in Greece, or in the Greek world as a whole, start to slowly disappear. You get a sort of a koine, more of a united Greek dialect, largely inspired by Attic. You can trace that in inscriptions, for example. It's very interesting. And during the Hellenistic period, you really have this main language. So the Ionians, as it were, sort of disappear because one of their most defining characteristics, the Ionian dialect, also goes away. So that's basically what we wanted to do with the issue, and also just to shine a light on who were the Ionians and what did they do and why are they important.
We've got these they're city-states, mainly around Asia Minor, and then they colonized out predominantly on coastal. They didn't go inland.
The island of Euboeans were also Ionians, and they spread out through most of the islands and into Asia Minor. So it's really the central area in the Aegean where you have all of these Ionians, and they spread out. They really are at the forefront of developments in Greece, also with the Anthony Snodgrass's Greek Renaissance of the 8th century BC, as he calls it. They're very, very much at the forefront. If you look at sites like Lefkandi, for example, it's very much at the forefront of developments in Greece after or at the very end of the Dark Ages already. And they also spread out. They found trading posts in Italy and Sicily, and they go to Syria, where they have Elmina, and eventually also, of course, they in the 7th century, supposedly, according to Herodotus, Ionian mercenaries and mercenary traders, together with Carian mercenaries, and Carians come from further south in Asia Minor, opposite Rhodes, let's say, which is traditionally more Dorian country, by the way, as far as Greeks are concerned. They travel into Egypt also and become mercenaries there, and eventually even settle at Naucratis.
Are we going to say that these Ionians are actually being pushed out of Greece by a Dorian invasion, or because I've heard a lot, read a lot here and there about these ideas sort of being a little bit more doubted these days, in terms of, was there really a Dorian invasion that really physically pushed them out, or were they more, traders as such, moving out and actually colonizing like the later Greeks do?
Yeah, I think certainly the Dorian invasion was an older version of events, whereas probably there's been a bit of revisionism to not nullify, but certainly offer alternatives to that theory.
As far as Dorian invasion is concerned, it's a very sticky topic, like all of these invasion theories. And we know, of course, from historic periods that you can have mass migrations and stuff. It's just that for the Greek situation, it's not particularly clear when and how we should picture the Dorian invasion. And there are loads of conflicting theories, and I think the most recent theory, but no doubt Cezary is better informed on this than I am, is that there probably wasn't a Dorian invasion as such. It has even been suggested, though I cannot recall off the top of my head where it was or who did that, for example, the Dorian dialect actually dates back to the Bronze Age. There is some evidence for that as far as I can remember, but I'm not entirely sure, so don't hold me to that as such. But the difficulties of trying to locate the Dorian invasion archaeologically, which is what we have to do, is profound.
I know that there's just many difficulties, and especially recently, so it's hard to say. It's hard actually to say to what extent it was related to what was happening in Ionia at all. So
Yeah, there's a lot of conflicting ideas. There is the later Greeks also kept revising their history, of course, going back in time, where at one point they come up with this whole story of the return of the Heraclids, which they also tie with to the Dorian invasion. And then, of course, you have archaeology and especially linguists looking at the development of dialects in Greece and how that relates to the fall of the Mycenaean palaces and the idea that the language spoken in Arcadia and on Cyprus are related, and that the idea is that the Mycenaeans were pushed either into the heartland of the Peloponnese or out towards Cyprus when Dorians, whatever they were, invaded and took hold of the Peloponnese, moved south and invaded and took hold of the Peloponnese. But there's a lot of, it's a very difficult web to untangle, and I don't think anybody has come up with a very satisfying way to tie everything together, or if that's even possible. I doubt it, actually. But
I think one answer that has actually been offered to it, and maybe the case that it's not valid anymore, is that if there was any mass movement towards Ionia, that was probably in the beginning of the 12th century BC, right, from Greece. And it seems that there may have been a bigger movement in the beginning at this one point, and you could argue that may have been the Dorian invasion or something else. But ever since that supposedly mass movement, what happened is there were many sort of movements which were much smaller, and so I guess there's room to say something about this, but it's all, we just don't really know enough. As
yeah, one
Josho
added
said.
wrinkle, for
So-
example, is that during the late Bronze Age, you have what would later become big East Greek cities like Ephesus and Miletus, which were already inhabited during the Bronze Age, and probably by a mixture of Mycenaeans and local Anatolian peoples. So you have Miletus, for example, was Milavanda, and Ephesus was Apasa in Asia Minor. So you already had these fairly sizable towns, these sort of, well, I don't want to say precursors, these sizable conglomerations, very cosmopolitan as far as we can determine, with Mycenaeans and Anatolians, Luwian peoples, Hittites, whatever, living together and forming these communities. So same with the Ionian migration, which is typically put somewhere around the 10th, 9th centuries BC. That's a little bit of a difficult issue right now, because, like Cezary said, there is no evidence for such mass migration, especially not because there's a lot of continuity apparently there in Asia Minor from the Bronze Age onwards through the Iron Age already.
I think the other thing, of course, is that the idea of there being an earlier period where they've been pushed out doesn't quite fit with the colonization period of the 8th and 7th centuries. That sort of having it happen twice is a tricky thing, and that would be an interesting contradiction if it had occurred earlier because of migration pressure, and then it happens again because of population pressure or whatever other reasons for colonization.
So my question is then, as someone who doesn't really know much about this period, you've talked about the Bronze Age, where my impression is that not a lot of written information comes out. Where is this body of knowledge coming from? Is this archaeology? What is it?
It's a mix of different things. It's a mix of tablet archive information and loads of archaeology, of course, that allows us to reconstruct the image of what it may have been like during the late Bronze Age. But there are a lot of unknowns as far as the Bronze Age is concerned. There's sometimes an idea that you can say very definitive things about the Bronze Age, and I have a few books here from Osprey about the late Bronze Age, including a book, I won't name the authors, including a book that has a reconstruction of an Indo-European warrior, which is very interesting, never before seen, for very obvious reasons. But there is a lot about the Bronze Age that we don't know for sure. But what you can trace, for example, in archives, in tablet information, names, for example, are very important. You can find in an archive, for example, somebody who's referred to as a slave and then given a name like, the Luwian, so you know that it's a slave from Anatolia. Other names are also given. Sometimes places are named also. So you can infer a lot from that in what kinds of people live in a particular place. And otherwise, with archaeology, of course, you can sort of, though that is always a little tricky, look at the objects and see what they have in order to figure out what context they had, what kind of ethnic backgrounds they may have had, what kind of origins, etc., etc.
And they're mentioned also by Egyptians and Hittites and other neighbors?
I don't exactly know what the Hittites say, but the Hittites do write some stuff about the situation in Western Anatolia and how that is organized, etc., etc. But it's not part of the core region of the Hittite Empire itself. It's mostly vassals, as far as I know, where they give some information about what's going on there. For example, there are some letters that I mention in my book, if I recall correctly, that may have served as inspiration for the Trojan War stories. An adventurer called Priamaradu, who, with the support of the Ahiava, so the Greeks probably, is raiding the vassal areas, that or the areas where the Hittites have a power base, also, the vessels or whatever. So
I think it does actually quite say a lot that we don't have that much surviving in terms of archaeology, because I think, myself being a historian, what we actually know, historians from our literary sources, I think the earliest one that mentions the Ionian migration is Pherecydes, who's basically an Athenian mythographer from the very late Archaic period. We don't have his work surviving. And his explanation is basically that the whole migration was, from what I remember, organized by Neleus, who was the father of Nestor. So that's what historians know about Ionian migration from Pherecydes. So if archaeologists don't actually know more about it, then I'm afraid we may never actually know how that happened and when.
One of the other things, of course, is reasonable academic speculation, because when you're dealing with a Dark Age, you know, as we find out with other Dark Ages, that there's actually more information than we thought we had. But with the, you know, this one, there's sort of like, well, this is happening because this is where they end up. Therefore, that must have happened. And there's this other group, the Dorians, who've come in, and we don't know where they came from. Therefore, you know, and I think that until there's reasonable alternatives, those theories can hold sway.
We've also got the Sea Peoples mentioned in terms of the raiding at, you know, either in the 1100s or you know, around the turn of that time, that whether they actually play a part in actually making up the later population or not. I mean, is there any evidence to say that they're not part of the Ionian population that will actually populate the islands later on? Or?
Yeah, the Sea Peoples is a very thorny issue. That they pop up around 1200 BC. Ramesses III fights them, possibly. They may have been involved in the destruction of Ugarit. Around 1200 BC, you see loads of interesting things happen, especially in coastal areas. We have the archives from Pylos making mention of people being sent to the sea to look out for something, some kind of danger, and then the archive gets burned. At Ugarit, we have some letters that were destroyed before they could be sent, probably asking for help. So there's. You also see in the 12th century, after the disaster has taken place, for example, in Crete, that loads of people abandon towns near the coast and retreat inland. So there's loads of indications throughout the eastern Mediterranean seaboard of some sort of force that attacks from the sea and then destroys everything and then goes away again, like you know, a horde of locusts traveling through the Mediterranean. But there are loads of stuff that we just don't understand exactly. We don't understand why these people moved, who they were precisely, where they came from. There are loads of interesting links between, for example, warrior figurines from Sardinia and stuff that you see at Medinet Habu in Egypt, except that the chronology doesn't pan out completely, which has also been fueling loads of discussions and debates. I've written something about it on the blog once or twice. So there are loads of unknowns in this particular area. The only thing that we can be sure of is that part of the destructions at least seem to be fueled by human actors, but we don't exactly know what their motives are, or etc., etc. And Eric Klein, of course, who in his book 1177 BC which has been selling like hotcakes. I'm very jealous. It's a good book. He tries to explain better what might have happened, and he puts it in a very broad perspective of systems collapse, etc., etc. But the fact is that we don't really know exactly what happened. And it's all a bit of a guess at this point. But still, 1177 is a good book. But it's completely different from whatever was going on. It's different from the later colonizing period in the 8th and 7th centuries, where we have a slightly firmer idea of what's going on, even though, again, the idea that this was because of food shortages or something, it's not really anything that's still being pursued these days. You have to remember that most of that information is based on what the ancient Greeks themselves wrote, and the ancient Greeks very much believed in a very active form of making history. You went somewhere and you did something, or you had a very specific reason to do something. It's very much person A has this happen to them and then does this. They go and found a colony, like that. It's a very active history, and that might not always have been the case, and that is maybe for historians not very gratifying, but it's not always people history, let's say.
I think that one thing that perhaps we should remember when to sort of sum up when we talk and think about the Ionian migration is that I think there is a narrative which we have been given, perhaps even by ancient historians, by Herodotus, and as I mentioned, by Pherecydes, and it was basically an Athenian narrative, which wants us to believe that there was a mass migration and that it was obviously organized by the inhabitants of Athens and Attica. And I think that for perhaps even a century, what archaeologists have been doing, they have been looking for evidence to support that. And I think what they found is that there probably isn't much to support the evidence of mass migration. So I think that's one important thing to remember, that everyone wants us to believe that there was mass migration of the Ionians, but most likely that was not how it happened. It was a gradual movement, a gradual process, which lasted perhaps for a few centuries. So that's one thing which I think is important to remember when one thinks of Ionian migration.
Yeah, there's a very distinctly political aspect to that, of course. With this story about the Ionian migration, it starts appearing at the end of the Archaic period. It becomes very pronounced during the course of the 5th century BC. At the same time that Athens, of course, is trying to found her own empire and trying to look for reasons, why to start conquering all these Aegean islands and Asia Minor, which happen to be, for the most part, Ionian. So it's sort of like saying, we're bringing you back into the fold, into Athens' warm embrace. So there's very much a political, propagandistic aspect.
It's pretext history, and it's like the weapons of mass destruction of the ancient world.
Ooh.
Ooh, controversy.
Well, it's about that time as well that Athens also go out of their way to bring back all the culture of Athens, make them a great cultural center, and sort of steal from Ionian Greeks every artist and sculptor and architect and thinker that there is. So it would fit, certainly.
I mean, the interesting thing about a lot of the Ionian tyrants is how culturally and architecturally and all these other advances that they make. I mean, Polycrates of Samos had the best sculptors, the best architects, the best jewelers, and was the envy of all Greece. The famous story of Amasis of Egypt refusing to be his friend because he was too lucky and his fall was going to be so huge. And that whole idea of that they were the cultural centers, and then later you get the sort of stealing of Ionian knowledge and expertise to make Athens greater, whereas they, at the time of the Pisistratids and Polycrates, there's it's balanced the other way, that the Ionians island states are in fact more powerful and more culturally defined than mainland Ionians.
Even to the extent that Athens is going and trying to dominate some of the religious centers over there as well. So bring back that balance of power in that respect from the East as such.
I think when in the question of who are the Ionians, I think what Josho said is pretty much good. given a good introduction, but I think one aspect which is really important is that Ionia was a really interesting area because it was, so to speak, a meeting point of East and West, and West, of course, being the Aegean Greece, and East being all the great sort of Near Eastern empires, but immediately, obviously, Anatolia. And I think that's one thing which many people have forget and do forget, because most of what we know about Ionia is from Greek sources. So I think literary is obviously Herodotus, and the image we have of Ionia is very much from the Greek perspective. But because we don't actually hear much from the other perspective, from East and Anatolia, that is something which I think is a very much sort of issue of recent research as to how Ionia interacted with Anatolia. And I think what we find out in the most recent research is that that interaction was actually quite strong and profound. And perhaps one area in which it was very strong was warfare and military history, which I think we may be talking about that later, but Josho mentions this in his book, Henchman of Ares. But I think that's why Ionia really is a fascinating place, because it really is that meeting point between Greece and all the Near Eastern empires. And I think, as a word of introduction, that's very important to remember.
Yeah, it's a gateway for loads of stuff that we take for granted now as typically Greek. That was actually adopted by the Greeks from the ancient Near East, like the symposium, for example, is most people consider that's something typically Greek. These Greeks lying on these beds, on these couches, and drinking and philosophizing. The only thing is, of course, you see that first in Eastern Greece at around the middle of the 7th century, and over the course of half a century it spreads from Eastern Greece, especially Ionia, to the West, so that by around 600, early 6th century BC, the symposium is an established Greek thing, except of course that it was probably adopted from Lydia. And you see sort of the same thing happening with coinage. Coins get invented by the Lydians, as far as we know, sometime in the 7th century. There's some people place it very early. I think it's probably second half of the 7th century at the earliest, where you have these coins, initially big denominations, about which there's also some discussion of what their exact purpose was. And you see that later the Greeks start adopting that also. There is a bit of a delay. The Greeks aren't as quick to adopt coinage as the Lydians are, and even the Lydians were probably using it in a moderate way. But by about 550, especially the second half of the 6th century, you also see coinage appear, of course, in Aegina and Athens and what have you. And that's also something that was adopted by the Greeks in the East because of their interactions with the Lydians. And a final thing that is interesting also, because I've done the research and I'm writing a book on fortifications now. If you look at fortifications, Greek fortifications after the Bronze Age, they first appear in Greek cities in Asia Minor. And they seem to be inspired, even though they are stylistically different as far as structure is concerned. They're structurally different from, but they seem inspired by Lydian fortifications further inland. And there is lots of back and forth between Greeks and Lydians as far as fortification building is concerned. There is even some evidence that they exchanged builders from one to the other. And the idea is also that the Greeks started fortifying their cities in Asia Minor, not just out of fear from attack, but also to compete with Lydian fortified cities further inland for status and prestige, just to be able to say, well, you've got a nice big wall, and look at my wall, it's even bigger, it's even nicer, and it's got 4 more towers than your wall has. So that sort of prestige and rivalry, that is also a factor. So you have this in Asia Minor. It's not just Greeks living there separate from everybody else. They're very much integrated in the whole Anatolian cultural matrix that you have there. Anatolia, of course, is a vast area, much bigger than Greece itself. with a wide variety of different cultures. Aside from the Lydians, you have the Carians, you have Phrygians, or at least remnants thereof. Later you also get the Persians. You've got all sorts of variety of people, Mysians. If you look at Herodotus, there's a vast list of all the people that live in Anatolia, and all these people work together and exchange ideas and influences, and it went one way from Greece to Anatolia, but it also went, of course, and probably in a much more stronger way, from Anatolia to Greece. So you have this whole amalgam in Anatolia, which also makes it very difficult to sort of, when you excavate the city and say, okay, well, this is where the Greeks lived, and this is where the Lydians lived, and this is where it's not as easy as that. And it's a good point that Cezary is making, that it's very much a meeting point between different peoples at that particular time. And I'll say my introduction in the article, for example, in the issue, I said that Sardis was sort of like the Paris of the age in the Archaic period. Because if Greeks thought about, a big city, a big cultural city in the way that we nowadays think of, there was something like New York or London or Paris, it was Sardis. It was the capital of the Lydian Empire that counted as, the place where you would go to in order to visit a really big city. It's why Solon goes to Croesus, according to Herodotus, for example. Everybody goes to Sardis at some point if they want to be something. So it's very much a much more cosmopolitan world maybe than we sometimes think about, and much more a lot more cultural interaction than is often made clear.
So the burning of Sardis during the revolt is a huge deal.
It's a gigantic deal.
Yeah.
They could have always surrendered it like the French did in Paris in 1940 or something. So to segue into the question, which was about trade, so the initial interactions between these myriad people would surely have been through trade, right? I mean, they didn't go to war straight away. That would have been presumed based on things. But trade was the cause for people to get together and share things.
You've got the idea of Xenia also extending over that entire area, so that would back up that sort of idea of it being established on trade links and which are further between the different cities across the Aegean.
Yeah, I'd use the word exchange more than, because it incorporates trade, but it also incorporates diplomatic ties and ritualistic friendship like Xenia and that sort of stuff. So there's a lot going on, because you have to remember, in this particular, especially in the Archaic period, you don't have hotels where you can go to if you travel to another place. If you want to go somewhere, somebody has to provide you with shelter, otherwise you're sleeping outside. So that's what those ties of friendship also were for. You go somewhere, you ask, hey, a social peer, you say, hey, can I stay here? And they entertain you, and they wine you, they dine you, and with the idea that it's reciprocal. So at some point, if this person ever comes to your country, ever comes to your city, then you're going to put them up. So that's sort of the idea behind that. They were a lot more social in those days than they are nowadays, I think.
So by welcoming strangers, you learn about the world, you learn about current affairs as far as they can be current when you're on your feet. But I suppose it hints at a different kind of worldview, and to sort of move it into, let's say, the 18th century in England. I mean, most people didn't leave their town. They, to go to the nearest town and market, there was a big event in your life. And again, there were sort of customs that enabled people to arrive, and they wouldn't have any unnecessary trouble when they did that, but that's how people found out about things.
So we've got raiding. They were also known for raiding. Where does that fit in with trading? Surely is not one possibly counterproductive? You can't exactly go and burn everybody down, houses down on your raids, and then come back and sell things.
Well, one could imagine a situation where, under the normal circumstances, hospitality rules and so on break down when somebody wants something and someone refuses to give it, and out of that burns this other issue, and it could be spontaneous rather than planned. And I guess that hints at the question of these raids. Were they pre-planned, or were they spontaneous acts of, shall we say, vandalism?
A quick point is that, for example, if you look at the Homeric epics, a standard question that you ask a stranger is, are you here on some specific business, or are you roving like pirates?
Wow.
So that is a normal question to put to somebody that you've never met before. And obviously, you know, when you ask the question, they're not killing you. So you know that they're either passing through on their way to a victim, or that they're there on a specific kind of business. So it could be either trading or diplomacy or something else. So, but it's very much raiders and traders. The difference is nil, I would say.
What you said about Homer and how that question is being asked, that's exactly right. But the thing we should also say is that there is an answer to that question which I think the Homeric heroes expect, and that is that I am obviously not a trader. I am, I mean, there's a difference between being a trader and a raider, so to speak, and a pirate. And I think the picture we very much get in Homer and in the Odyssey is especially that being a trader is somehow less honorable, and it's not fitting and not suitable for those Homeric heroes, whereas being a raider and being a pirate is something completely acceptable, and in fact it's a very honorable activity to be doing. It's a way for these Homeric heroes to prove themselves, to acquire extra wealth, to sometimes even to make new friends. And so I think although the two do go hand in hand, you have to say that in Homer at least there's quite a big difference between trading and being a pirate, and very much towards saying that, as I've said, being a trader is something not suitable for Homeric heroes. And in fact, I think the only people described as traders in the Odyssey are the Phoenicians. And,
yeah, in the Odyssey, you only have Phoenicians as traders. In the Iliad, it's slightly more complicated, because when they are in Troy, there is this local prince from an island nearby that comes and trades wine with them in exchange for spoils. So in the Iliad, it's slightly different from in the Odyssey. But in the Odyssey, it's always Phoenicians.
I wonder if there's a parallel here. For example, we talk about Vikings as sort of heroic, but they really were raiders. And as I understand it, they were one part of Norse society. And the Norse society were the traders, the craftsmen. So you've got this bunch of people who thrive on the vigor, the courage, the adrenaline rush of invasion and taking, and the other people come and do the hard work of trading. And you get the parallel with the Ionians, perhaps.
Well, I think there's the idea that to go a Viking is the same. You know, are you just marauding like a pirate? But the idea in Viking history is that in fact the trader-raider distinction is inexact, that your traders are your raiders, and that they will raid when they see the circumstance suiting a raid, and they will take away portable wealth that they see as portable, such as monasteries and monks and human wealth as well. But they will also trade for things that they view as tradable. And so it can come down, I think, if you take it back to the Ionians, that it can come down to social mores and reciprocity again, the importance of reciprocity. That if someone's offended you and hasn't given you shelter when you've requested it, and those sorts of social laws, then they're up for a raid quite easily. But if you establish social relationships, then trading partnerships can be established. But I think that like seasonal warfare, and I know that seasonal warfare is again controversial in Greece these days, but the idea that there's a raiding season, and that it's not necessarily dangerous to your health, that there's a raiders coming, they're going to raid, give them what they want, they'll go away, and hopefully we can establish more concrete relations with them to make it more stable. So I think that it's a far more flexible kind of definition, rather than saying they're traders or they're raiders. But that question in Homer, that clearly you could be one or the other by simply being a stranger in a strange land, and your answer, your word is your bond. I'm a trader, and then you happen to raid. You've sort of broken social laws.
Well, and of course, the ultimate breaking the social norm in that case, of course, is the whole Troy story, isn't it? I mean, you've got Paris takes away Helen, and that causes great consequences. So someone, if he'd have followed the convention, he would have said, "Thank you very much indeed, nice to know you," and gone back alone. And of course, then the Odyssey is the opposite of that, where you've got other people overstaying their welcome. And in a sort of inverted sense, you've got Odysseus is trying to raid back, but he doesn't use the arms and armor of a warrior necessarily. He uses wile and charm and intellect, the gifts that he's been given, to do it much more subtly.
Well, I think that one thing that does happen with the Ionians, which I think is quite interesting, is that um, their first sort of raiding activities that we do know about is, as I wrote in my article, was in the region of North Syria and Syria, and they were raiding then the empire of the Assyrians. And what's interesting is that the Greeks had some settlements over there, which were sort of the posts where they did most of the trading. The most famous of them was of course Almina. But what we do know about it is that actually Ionians from Asia Minor were not that active over there in the 8th century. But it was actually mainly the Euboeans that were doing most of their sort of activities in terms of trade through Almina, and it wasn't the Ionians from Asia Minor. And what we perhaps do hear about some Ionians from Asia Minor and their activities in Syria is that they are actually raiding and probably nothing much else. And there's been a theory that they may have had a base in Cilicia from which they were basically organizing all those raiding expeditions, which were then, of course, that base was obviously overtaken by the Assyrians. But what happens is while the Assyrians, in the beginning, they don't really mind, but then they realize that, oh, these Ionian Greeks, they are a problem, they are a nuisance, we need to deal with them. And they do deal with them fairly quickly. And then in the 7th century, what we see that the Ionian Greek activities of the Ionian Greeks from Asia Minor actually changes in that region. And it's not raiding anymore, but it's primarily mercenary service and activities which have nothing to do with raiding. And I think that's quite interesting, that 8th century, what we hear is only raiding, and then that sort of disappears and changes into activities which are, I suppose, more peaceful, involving mercenary service and trade.
Can this be a reflection of the actual land that they're coming from? Because Cilicia ends up becoming a base for pirates when you get to the 2nd and 1st century for the Romans as well. And of course, Pompey has to famously go and deal with them in that particular area. And then, if you look at the history of Alexander the Great has problems in terms of health going through there, and it gets emphasized that yes, that's a high area of malaria, which also is something that's found out in the First World War as well, of course. But I mean, if all these guys are coming from this southwest corner of Asia Minor, is it something to do with the land and their from time to time hardships coming along that forces them into either piracy or mercenary service all the time?
I think that's probably it, because as you say, that area over there is very famous for that sort of activity, and it may be the hardship and whatever happens over there. I think that there is something to say about that 8th century was different than the 7th century for Ionian Greeks, and I think the reason why we don't hear about the raidings so much in the 7th century and later on in that area is probably because the Assyrians do deal with that threat quite well indeed, and what they do at the end of dealing with it is they force all those Ionian Greeks to serve for them as mercenaries. And I think what happens for them is they realize, well, actually, if we serve for them as mercenaries, that's quite good, because we do get our goods, we do get our booty, we don't have to risk as much, and it's actually much better to serve as mercenaries. So that's one thing that happens. And the other thing which I think happens is all the Greeks actually realize that there's a lot of wealth to be gained from interacting with the area over there, Syria and Phoenicia. So why raid if we could, interact with those areas and actually do interactions which are much more economically profitable? So I think that there's definitely a change from the 8th to the 7th century that we do see.
One thing that I wanted to say is a change from the 8th to 7th century. You don't just see that with the Ionians. You see that through most of Greece, where you see this move away from smallish warbands and raiding to larger organizational or more structural approaches to enhancing economic status, as it were, if that's the prime motivator, which probably coincides with, you have this idea of the rise of the polis, which I always find very problematic. But it's basically the emergence of larger cities and especially larger territories. And I think if you look, I looked at the vase paintings, and of course that's a whole can of worms that you can open with that. But if you look at the art, you see this shift of an emphasis on ships and sea fighting, and probably raiding, to more an emphasis on fighting over land. And I think you also see that in the literary evidence. And I think it probably ties into a growth of territories where communities interact more often with each other because their borders are now, they now have borders in between their territories, instead of being smallish towns, villages like things where it's much easier to get a couple of men together, take out your ship and go raiding. Basically everything gets larger in the course of the 7th century. That makes raiding a much more dangerous and less socially acceptable thing to do. Hans Verwees has also written about that, of course, and speaking about the Vikings, he in a lecture compared Athenian raiders to Vikings also, a lecture that I kept missing, by the way. I've never seen it because there was always something else going on, but I know the contents. So it's there's lots going on from the 8th to the 7th century. There's loads of different things going on. It's a very dynamic period. That is often just sort of referred to like, this is the rise of the polis, and that sort of explains everything, which it doesn't really. It's something that's worth studying by yourself, as a subject in itself. The 7th century is when you also get, the first monumental architecture, monumental sculpture, very heavily influenced by the East, very heavily influenced by Assyrian and Egyptian art and architecture, the temples and the Kuroi statues and whatever. In the second half of the 7th century. So there's again a lot of interaction between Greeks and the East, and a lot of stuff that the Greeks import from the East. And probably also this idea maybe that the Greeks thought, we should be able to cooperate with these foreign powers, like what Cezary also said, instead of just, going there, killing some of their men and stealing some women and some cows and then going back again. And that's also where these mercenaries who really become this fixture in the 7th century and stay there also throughout the entire Archaic and Classical period in the ancient Near East. These Greek mercenaries, probably vast numbers of Greek mercenaries, exactly how vast is the question, but the idea that there was this explosion in the 4th century is probably incorrect. There were always loads of Greek mercenaries in the ancient Near East. That was probably far more important also than most people assume.
Where would they be garrisoned? I presume, are we got garrison ships floating about, as they're hired, or are they, we need them in Egypt, or we'll have a garrison and keep them there, or
No, they're housed in garrisons. We found some of them. Archaeologists have found some of them, including in what is now Israel. I forget the name, but they found an Argive shield there, for example, and a couple of helmets. And we know of garrisons in Egypt where Greeks were stationed. There were Naucratis, there were the camps, etc. Cezary maybe has a better idea exactly of the particulars.
Yeah, I think the one you referred to was Mesat Hashavyahu, which is, I think, we don't actually know. We know that the Greeks were staying there. We know that they were most likely Ionians. We don't exactly know who they were serving for, which just shows that by that moment in time, they were employed for pretty much anyone in Near East, whether that's Egypt or Babylonia or as I said in the beginning, Assyria. But I think that one thing what does happen is that these numbers grow. These numbers do grow, as Josho mentioned, and I think they probably start with serving for Assyrians, and perhaps the big moment when this whole thing started was when the Assyrians forced them to serve for them. That's when they realized, oh, actually, these guys are pretty nice. We can fight for them. We get our rewards, and it is worth it. But I should imagine that these numbers initially weren't very big. and that it was just a few of them. And I think another question we have to ask is who was fighting there and how they could afford their equipment. Because I actually think that initially it was mainly the people that were able to provide their own equipment that served in those armies. I think that must have been the case for Assyria and Babylon. I think that only began to change with Egypt when we suddenly hear that these numbers grow exponentially to 30,000, which is an absolutely ridiculous number that we do get from Herodotus. But when we realize how big it actually is, that does, as Josho said, the whole mercenary revolution of the 4th century just makes no sense. If we do actually,
is there no backing up of
right.
when you the expansion of the mercenaries in the 4th century? Is there? I've heard some explanations along the lines of, well, you've got all the warfare going on in the 5th century, and it is a hangover of so many people making a living out of the second half of the 5th century warfare that they are looking for something to continue on that profession, and that is where they get drawn over towards towards Asia Minor to continue that.
Yeah, that's something that's been suggested before, that the mercenaries of the 4th century BC are largely the result of all these leftover mercenaries troops from the wars of the 5th century BC. I don't really buy that, because if you look back in time during the Archaic period, these mercenaries are always there. So it seems very strange that, you know, in the 5th century you had these leftover mercenaries that had nothing to do, and like Xenophon, they went and they fought for Persians or whatever. They always did that. There were always Greeks in these Near Eastern armies anyway, and probably in quite large numbers. And the point that Cezary raised about there being smaller numbers of mercenaries maybe at the beginning, and people who could afford their own equipment. We have a very famous source, of course, the brother of Achaeans. Achaeans, who was a poet from Lesbos around 600 BC, composed a poem in which he said, "Oh, my dear brother, you have returned from the east," something like that, from Babylon, where you slew a man who was 7 feet tall, I don't remember, a giant at least. And the king was so impressed that he gave you this silver-studded sword. So that's something that, you know, if you wanted to prove yourself to your community, one way to do that was basically to say, okay, you know what, I'm off to be a mercenary for some exotic Eastern king for a few years, and I'll come back, you know, laden with all this treasure, you know. So
sounds a bit like the Crusades, really, and when you put it like that.
It's probably similar in that particular, except that there is no religious component to that. But it's very much, of course, these men going away, then coming back later, which is the important thing. They come back and, you know, showing to these people, look, this is a helmet that I got from some barbarian in the east who I slew. I just chopped his head off, and this is a sword that the king gave me because of my service. So it enhances your position in the community itself. You know, in the Far East, where you were a mercenary, you were just a mercenary basically. So, you know, you weren't a part of that society. But when you come back, you can use your experience, you can use the treasure that you acquainted to enhance your own status at home. You get more political power, get more sway, whatever you want. So it's an important career step also for aristocrats and other higher ups to engage on a mercenary career, and far less likely to get the ire of the rest of your community than going out to be a pirate.
Surely they weren't all just aristocratic. I mean, it would be. Surely, come on, let's go and fight some wars. It's just me and the Sir so you've got to take people really to do a lot of the grunt work with you.
It sort of depends on how you assume being an aristocrat was defined in the ancient world and in ancient Greece in particular. The general idea is that the aristocracy wasn't that there were, or rather, let's say, that there was an elite who managed things, but that that was a group of people that jockeyed for power amongst themselves, and also with people who were maybe not politically their peers, but at least as far as wealth and you know, basic status were concerned, were more or less similar or comparable, so that you had a fairly sizable proportion of society in early Archaic Greece at least that would qualify as rich. Ian Morris referred to them as the agatoi, the good people, of which only a small portion would probably have been the actual people in power. But you had all of this rivalry and status rivalry going on. And of course, for archaic Greece, we have all these stasis, these in aristocratic strife between different factions and families jockeying for power. So it may very well have been that something like maybe 20% of the population, or 30% maybe even, could qualify for agathos status as such, so probably wider than is normally considered. Didn't really become, even in the classical period, it was fairly flexible still.
I think one thing which we do need to remember about especially this early period is that the question of land and looking after your land. And I think these wealthy landowners were able to engage in other activities because they basically had others to look for their land for themselves, so they could fight as mercenary, be raiders, do anything else. Whereas the majority of people weren't able to do that because they needed to look after their land. Hence, there's this idea that the Greeks were mainly fighting in the summer, because outside of summer, because they needed to look after their crops and their land, which also meant that those less wealthy perhaps weren't able to engage in those mercenary activities, which would often be for years, because they needed to look after their land. And I think that probably was a factor as well.
Yeah, the only thing you probably would have is impoverished people who would be among the following of the wealthy. And I think if you look at Xenophon with the Anabasis, you have basically more or less the same idea, with Xenophon as a high-standing member of society, having the luxury and the time and the finances and the wherewithal to say, you know what, I'm going to pack up and I'm going to go with this Persian usurper, and I'm going to fight there for a while and acquire riches and whatever. And that's probably something that you can trace back all the way to the Archaic period, and it's sort of the model that you also have with these 8th century raids, probably, where you have these little war bands of these princes, whoever you want to call them, and their followers, 50 men going on a boat and rowing to an island and getting some cattle. It's basically the same sort of idea. These socially high-ranking individuals taking the lead in the mercenary business also.
It's funny that you should describe it like that as well, because when you look at the early Roman history as well in Livy, I mean, much of the earliest warfare there is essentially cattle raids of the type that you're describing. A bunch of men going out raiding another land, and then there being reprisal attacks later on. So it's, I mean, again, I know sort of Herodotus makes a erroneous suggestion that some of these Ionians go across and inhabit some of the parts of northern Italy and whatnot. So whether these are just shared cultural norms at the time as well.
Yeah, cattle raiding is very typical for a particular type of society, I would argue. You also have, Irish folklore of cattle raids and stuff, and it's you see it in New Guinea among tribespeople raiding for supplies and animals, and it's I don't really like use of models and such, but you can say that there's when particular conditions are met for a particular type of society, you have this tit-for-tat raiding that is very common, and Hans van Wees, of course, has famously compared the Homeric style of warfare with the type of warfare practiced by the New Guinea tribesmen, and I think there's a lot to be said for that, and it's probably some sort of cultural universal that you see all around the world with these types of societies, and that changes when these societies become bigger, more anonymous. You don't always recognize somebody in the street from who they are, from what you used to be able to do, and as a necessity become more centrally organized. So you see that very nicely in archaic Greece, where in the course of the 6th century you have these decrees and public statements of friendships and peace treaties and whatever appear, where it really becomes you get magistrates and political office and whatever. You really see this develop very nicely over the course of time, and in that world it's no longer acceptable that you're angry because your neighbor pinched some of your land, so you go out with a couple of mates and you get some of his geese, and then you say, now I've been recompensed. No, you go to court. So it changes, and already in Homer you can see that change sort of happening with the court scene on the Shield of Achilles and stuff like that, which nobody's been able to figure out precisely what it is. But
and the benefit of actually having treaties, of course, is you actually provide in the treaty itself means for remedies. So if actually somebody does something wrong, you don't have to go to war. You can go to an arbitrator, or between the two of you work out a remedy, compensation, or whatever it may be.
As mercenaries become more common and therefore raiding less common, does trade at the same time become more expansionistic? I know, for instance, that the 7th century is when the Samian pentaconta is meant to have been invented, this sort of wider bellied pentaconta that allowed more goods to be transported and therefore led to sort of trade expansion. And as your trade empire becomes more lucrative, that leads politically to, what we're talking about, treaties and things like that. So almost in a sense they become hand in hand, that as raiding ceases, not only do those raiders become mercenaries, but trading is therefore done in a more there's more trading going on.
Yeah, and I think the ideal example of that is without doubt Herodotus in his famous description of what happens in Egypt. He says that, obviously, as we all know, these brazen men arrived in Egypt intent on raiding, but if that was actually the case, we don't know. That it may have been, but what happens, of course, as we all know, they become enrolled by the Egyptian pharaoh, and they're quite successful. And then what he does is, in order to reward them, he gives them land. And they settle in Egypt, and that was also around about this time when they create this big trading post in Naucratis, which is, of course, exactly what you mentioned in terms of encouraging trade and creating new opportunities and intensifying it. So what happens is you begin with a story of raiding, which then turns into mercenary service and then opens up all those new doors for trade and interaction, and Egypt is actually the ideal example of that happening.
So if we have these large bodies of, going back to mercenaries, these large bodies of what are now professional soldiers, and all they're doing is professional soldiering, did they change the way that the nature of the battle, did they change how things were fought? Were they at the cutting edge of military technology?
Yeah, that is the question. The book Men of Bronze, edited by Donald Kagan and Gregory Vigiano, has a paper by John Hale on exactly this question, in which he argues that mercenaries were the first to develop the type of warfare that the Greeks were to be famous for. I don't remember the paper exactly anymore. I have to write my own paper for Cezary one of these days on not this particular topic, but it's sort of related. But he sort of suggested that that it wasn't the birth of what is characteristically considered typically Greek warfare, and I won't argue the point that I don't think there is such a thing as typically Greek warfare as such. But he suggested it didn't happen among the middle-class farmers that Hansen proposes, or among the aristocratic wealthy landowners that Hans van Wees proposes, but among the mercenaries working in the big armies of the ancient Near East. And it is, of course, interesting, because the idea is that the Greeks were the first to fight in formation is something that is clearly wrong, yet it keeps being repeated again and again. Because we know, for example, that the Egyptians already in the 3rd millennium BC deployed their troops in formation, and they marched in formation, and they may have fought in formation as well. We know chariot formations and that sort of stuff. We don't know the particulars, but we know that they use formations, and it's probably the only way that you can organize an army that numbers more than 10,000 men, not have them be just gigantic mob, but to have them arranged in some sort of formation. And it is possible, of course, that the Greeks first saw this in, the armies back home were maybe small. Salmon in the 70s, I think, wrote an article where he suggests that the archaic Greek armies were typically hundreds of people numbered hundreds of people instead of thousands of people. And that this changed in the course of the Archaic period. Of course, when the Greeks served as mercenaries in these big armies in the ancient Near East, there were these armies that didn't belong to smallish city-states, but they belonged to these big kingdoms and these big empires, and they numbered thousands of people. And they were deployed in formations. And the Greeks, we know, for example, from the inscription at the Temple of Abu Simbel, belonging to Ramesses II, where Ionians carved an inscription in one of the just below the knee of one of the statues of Ramesses, that the Greeks in that army were commanded by a Greek named after Psammetichus, the pharaoh, or one of the earlier pharaohs. So they were commanded. It says specifically, Psammetichus commanded the foreign-speaking troops. So they were probably the Greeks, maybe also Carians, for example. So we know that they were deployed in these units to themselves, and it's very possible that the Greeks there learned, hey, you know, it's useful if we deploy in formation, even though I think it's probably something that you do more or less naturally. When you get larger numbers in an army, you want to organize them in a good way.
Are you saying that when you're saying that this is where the not to upset you here, typical Greek hoplite, originates, etc. If you're sort of speaking about weaponry, wouldn't they have to have some sort of disposable income that they can actually use to purchase or bring about a change in weaponry? Or, I mean, wouldn't it make more sense that the weapons come from an established mode of warfare that they are taking with them into mercenary service?
Yeah, that's a bit of a different thing. I was talking mostly about tactics, but if you look at Greek equipment, if you look at Greek armor and weapons, you can make a case that for example, the typical Greek sword used in the Archaic period for most of the time is derived from the Now II Bronze Age sword, as a virtually straight line from the very end of the 13th century all the way down to about 550, 500 BC. You can start seeing in late Attic black figure and early red figure, you can see swords changing from the Now II type sword with the sort of crescent-shaped hand edge along the top of the blade to a sword with a straight crossguard, basically. You can see that happening. And other parts of the equipment, we don't exactly know where they all came from. The metal helmet was probably inspired from Assyrian examples, and also it has been argued that the bronze facing of the Argive shield was maybe also derived from Argive examples. The metal cuirass may have been derived ultimately from the Dender cuirass from the late Bronze Age, from the 15th century, I think, 14th century BC. I have to look it up, which was exported somehow from Greece to say eastern France, and then later transported back. Snodgrass wrote an interesting article about that in the 70s, also in 77 or something. The earliest Greek body armor, which he also supposes that it may have been especially suited for people who spent a lot of time on horses, which also tied back to my article that I wrote in 2007. But anyway, so there is loads of influence from the East probably, and from other places as well, that the Greeks probably developed or fine-tuned in Greece itself and then took with them to the Near East.
I think one nice example of this is the famous amethyst bow, which I've asked Josho to include in my article in Ancient Warfare, but he never did for some reason. But it is actually a wonderful example of perhaps Ionian Greeks fighting for Near Eastern armies, and in fact it depicts it's a siege of a city, or a siege of a town or a fortress. And I think we have an army, the army which does the offense is basically a most likely Near Eastern army, because you have both archers there, which are quite heavily armed, you have the horsemen, you have some chariots, and then you have I think 4 men who you could say were hoplites, and I think they were wearing Ionian helmets from what I do remember. They have blazons on their shields. So although I think some historians do say that they may not necessarily be Greek, I think that they probably are Greek. And I think even more interesting thing is that the defenders of that fortress, there's most likely some Greeks there as well, and they may also be hoplites. And it's an actual depiction of how these warriors may have been used in those Near Eastern armies, and they seem to have their own equipment that they brought from Greece. So they do have the long thrusting spear most likely. They do have the hoplite shield, they have the hoplite helmets, they have the greaves. I'm not sure about armor, but that's definitely Greek equipment.
Yeah, maybe we can go back to the Anatolian issue, because this is something that the paper that I'm writing for Cezary, for the book based on the conference that we had last year in April in London. I gave a lecture there about how the typical Greek hoplite equipment, if you want to call it hoplites at this stage, which I think is anachronistic, but anyway, that equipment we first see not in Greece, but we see it in Anatolia in various different forms. There are some pottery fragments from Gordion, for example, so Phrygia, that show men with what looks like metal helmets and round shields sitting on horses in exactly the same way as they would 200 years later be depicted on Greek vases. And there is a lot of interaction going on there also. If you look at Herodotus claiming that the Carian armorers, were responsible for developing the method of attaching crests to helmets and a few other innovations associated with Greek armor. It's very clear that what we consider typically Greek equipment may not be typically Greek, but probably arose in this Anatolian Greek amalgam, and was then the origins there was sort of lost in time and has become associated with Greeks in particular. Hans van Wees at the same conference also gave a paper in which he argued that the equipment, that this idea of a heavy-armed warrior fighting on foot wasn't typically Greek, wasn't invented by the Greeks as such, but that you see that all over the ancient Near East, that the Egyptians also had in their armies these heavily armed warriors, and that they didn't use Greeks because Greeks were special for some reason, which is what often people say. You know, the Greeks were special because they fought in phalanx formation and they had this marvelous equipment that nobody had ever seen before. He argues that what the Greeks added to these ancient Eastern armies was just more manpower. You have this country with all these people who are very eager to go and fight for you, and you say, okay, you come over here and you join my army. Now my army is 20,000 people bigger than my enemy's army. And that was basically the idea why the Greeks were so popular there, not because they were superior in a particular way to local troops, which is what usually suggested.
Yeah, and I think one thing to perhaps lend further support to that is that how I like to see it is that yes, they were most likely additional manpower, but whether they gave them the edge, I don't think so, because when you actually look at who they served for, they weren't very successful at what they were doing. Yes, they helped the Egyptians initially, but they did fight initially first for the Assyrians, and well, the Assyrians didn't do very well for very long, and then they switched to Babylonians, and that didn't last very long then either. And then, of course, was the Egyptians. And yes, it went well for a while, but then we have this account of Herodotus of one of the Egyptian pharaohs employing a massive number of 30,000 of them. And I don't remember now which one it was. Was it perhaps Aprius? And so he has this massive army with a lot of Greek mercenaries, and then he loses in this battle against the usurper, basically. And so were they really giving the edge? Well, I'm not sure.
No, it's also, of course, with the Persians later. It's exactly the same thing.
Well, yeah,
the Persians also use vast numbers of Greeks, and you know, if you look, and it's always to say, we talked about this last time also, I think, when we were talking about Memnon of Rhodes, who is this who is depicted as this genius Greek commander, and if only the Persians had listened to him, they would have won. Which is, of course, a little motif that comes back amongst Greek and Roman writers continuously. You know, especially Greek writers, Greek historians, where you have also in Herodotus the Greek advisor, the Greek traitor, basically the Greek who serves as an advisor to the Near Eastern despot, giving all this sage advice, and he's then ignored, of course, and then the sage king has a defeat on his hands, and it's usually too late, and the tide cannot be turned. And it's that thing that you also see with the Persians when they use Memnon of Rhodes and all these Greek mercenaries that later fight against other Greeks in Alexander's army. They also don't manage to win. So yeah, you can, they add more manpower, but you have to question how effective they exactly are, and if it's not a bit of a modern fable that the Greeks were used in these armies because they were so fantastically trained or whatever. And Hale in particular in his conclusion has this wonderful bit. Maybe I can look it up for a second.
Well, the one thing you could say is that they turned out very nicely. I mean, they looked great on the battlefield. Look at my shiny Greeks.
Yeah, I think one thing about that is that we do have obviously this famous fragment from Herodotus which speaks of these brazen men in shining armor. But what it actually is not. I think that account is from one of the peasants who saw them on the beach, and then he sees these brazen men in shining armor, and then he runs back to the pharaoh, sees, oh my God, I saw these warriors in shining armor, and which I think that may have been quite an effect. But as you say, I think they may have looked nice, but didn't do very well all the time. So
it was a game of bluff, you see. They were trying not to deploy them on the hope that intimidation alone would be sufficient to win.
Here is the quote from Hale, for example. So it's this book, Men of Bronze, Taken in Vigiano.
Josho, I have to say this is very cruel of you.
And page 190. Oh, well, it's not cruel. It's amazing because you see this line of reasoning in a lot of authors, and it just boggles the mind. I can understand somebody in 1890 writing this, but it's difficult, you know, in 2000 whenever this was published recently. That Hale says, and I quote, Greece was a harder land than most. Starting in the 8th century, its sons began to surpass all other dwellers around the Mediterranean in sheer physical strength and toughness, the ability to wield the heavy hoplite arms and carry them over long distances, and a fierce and battle-ready mentality. The cost of this mastery was the physical training required to manage the shield for long stretches of time. From this necessity sprang the masculine Greek mania for physical fitness, the idiosyncratic Greek pride in displaying and depicting their muscular, naked physiques, and the corresponding scorn for the stereotypical pale, soft, untanned bodies of Asiatics. As men who had developed a marketable skill, these early Greeks resembled not only Vikings, but also the Swiss pikemen of the Middle Ages, likewise famous as mercenaries and likewise native to a harsh and rocky homeland. The Ionian mercenaries serving Near Eastern and Egyptian rulers founded a Greek tradition that endured through the campaigns of Xenophon and the 10,000 down to the world wars of Alexander the Great and his successors.
Good Lord.
Yes, indeed. No, it's Hale's paper is interesting, and everybody should read it. But this final bit was really quite amazing in more than one aspect, and it sort of shows how far we still have to go in order to sort of get rid of all these assumptions that people make, based largely, I have to say, I mean, this isn't Hale's fault by any stretch of the imagination. This is born based on nearly centuries of historical writing on ancient Greece, and also on what the ancient Greeks themselves wrote and how they presented themselves. But it's something that when you look at all the evidence, it doesn't really make any sense, and doesn't seem to be borne out by the evidence at all.
Well, if they're nice middle-class warriors, they might be well turned out and buff. But that assumption, surely, mercenaries throughout history usually have been. I sort of struggle to believe that most of them aren't actually a large body of poor underclass who have a very good cadre of elite people driving them forwards, and actually would be a bit more of a ragtag bunch, picking things up as they go along and being handed the weapons that they were purchased for, presumably as a unit, by their unit.
Yeah, there isn't a lot of evidence for how exactly mercenaries were equipped. There is some evidence from the classical period, at least, that mercenaries at times were equipped with money, through money from their employers. But most of the time, they had to make do with what they could scrounge up themselves, basically. But I think a model where you have these aristocratic leaders who, just the prestige of having this following, these number of followers that you can take into battle with you, that would have been worth something to them, and might have been enough for them to say, okay, let's equip these guys with materiel and let's go and fight with them, with these underprivileged people, indeed.
Yeah, and I think there's something to say about that. It must have been more than the just the super wealthy, the people that were able to afford the equipment, because I think if we are to believe Herodotus and his numbers, which are basically 30,000, then what that means is that there just isn't enough of that wealthy class, that they were always the minority. So if you are to reach that number, you needed to include some people which were not as wealthy, and they needed to find their equipment somewhere. And I am inclined to believe that, that I think especially in Egypt, I think because mercenary service was so popular, I think it may have been organized as sort of on a regular sort of basis in Ionia, that some of the wealthy men were saying, okay, we're leaving to Egypt for mercenary service, who wants to join us? And I think they may have provided some men with weapon, and then perhaps have some gain back once they arrived in Egypt and were winning the gifts and the booty and all that. So, because if we are to imagine such a large number, then it must have included more than just the very wealthy men.
Yeah, and especially in Egypt, at one point, of course, at Naucratis, you have this whole Greek community that basically lives there. So it's not just Greek mercenaries, not just Greek men, but also, they get wives, they start families. And there is, for example, here, I live right around the corner from the National Antiquities Museum here in Leiden, and there's this nice sarcophagus, which is also in the issue, by the way, and also in Henchman, the picture that I took, which looks completely Egyptian, except that if you read the hieroglyphs, it says that I may look Egyptian, but I'm not. My parents came from Greece. And he has a very beautiful Egyptian name, but he is, and it includes also a reference to the pharaoh, Psamtik. But this is an Egyptianized Greek, basically, or somebody at least who, in his funerary traditions, decided to be mummified and buried like an Egyptian, but still points out, my parents came from Greece. So yeah, you have this. It's not just these mercenaries. It's probably also their wives and their families living there. And then, of course, if you have all of those people living there, it's natural that you will have a differentiated society there too. And I can very well imagine an impoverished son of an impoverished craftsman, the Greek craftsman who originally came from Euboea or wherever, saying, you know what, I'm going to join so and so on his tour of duty in the desert over there. I can imagine it very well, in the same way that people back in Greece would say the same thing when a famous aristocrat goes to join his mate in Naucratis and fight with the pharaoh, saying, you know what, I'm gonna follow him and see where that leads to.
Some of these mercenaries, though, in the Hellenistic period, seem to be quite like a ragtag bunch that are quite what's what I'm looking for. Unruly, etc. Alexander seems to have a lot of problems with the mercenaries under his command as he sort of heads further east. There's a couple of periods where he sort of sends bunches of them home because they seem to be having a destabilizing effect on the army at times with their demands for pay and whatnot. And it sort of seems to be a hangover as well from the Persian period, or the later Persian period, that the same sort of reputation has been gained by some of these mercenaries, that they're sort of, how can I say, they're demanding a lot for their service. They're demanding a little bit of a say as such in terms of what they expect in terms of their treatment.
You get that problem where there's no loyalty to the commander as well. So then you have to ask, how useful are they in battle if when the tide is turning possibly against you, you need them to give you the extra push, and you can't rely on them. Do you really need them with you?
Yeah, that probably would have been the same in the Archaic period. The only problem is that we don't really have the sources for that. There is the episode with Phanes of Halicarnassus, which isn't very typical, I guess. That is mentioned in Herodotus, where Phanes gets into an argument with the pharaoh and decides to bail out on him, and he's then later captured and then escapes again and goes to join the Persian king, and then he basically betrays the Egyptians, and his children are murdered in front of his eyes by his fellow mercenary troops. So yeah, but apart from that, I cannot think of anything for the Archaic period or even the 5th century.
I'm thinking more like in terms of like Alexander's later career. I mean, the threat that he makes to the Greek cities back in mainland Greece of actually returning exiles who had gone abroad to serve in foreign armies and whatnot seems to be, a real threat of, what these guys are doing in my army and in the other armies of the East, they can come back and do to you guys. As such, they just seem to really carry this bad reputation that at that stage seems to be fairly embedded.
Yeah, but there's no evidence for that, I think, in the Archaic period or the 5th century, unless Cezary can think of anything.
I can't think of anything because, as you say, Josho, the problem is our sources are so very limited. And apart from Herodotus, I think that's probably it. I think the only episode I can think of which is not even that is when basically what I mentioned, that huge army of mercenaries employed by Aprius, the Egyptian pharaoh, at the battle against the usurper, which I think his name was Amasis. I think they lose that battle, but then Amasis actually likes them, so he enlists them in his own army. So they just switch, and that seemed to went fairly smoothly. That they switch from one master to the other after they've lost the battle, but I guess you wouldn't have a choice. So, but otherwise, yes, we just don't know enough about mercenaries apart from Herodotus. He's our only source.
Well, I think that probably is a good place to finish. I'd like to thank Josho, Murray, Lindsay, Mark, and Cezary. Don't forget to have a look at ancient-warfare.com for more information on the magazine and other related bits and pieces. This has been the Ancient Warfare Magazine podcast, brought to you by thehistorynetwork.org. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.